So let's dive right into it. The first part of the 7 steps is called define the problem. And it might seem like an obvious thing to do, but when you work on problem definition and you do it in a very precise and effective and conclusive way, you might find the solution to your problem already. Very often it's about asking the right question in order to find the relevant answers, right? So Steve Jobs was a believer in this, and you can see from the many great solutions that they found at Apple that actually it's all about asking the right questions. One of the examples in this context is the introduction of the iPhone, where at the time, if you recall, you probably don't, judging by the looks of your faces, but at the time when the iPhone was introduced, most phones that were available in the market had physical physical keyboards on them. So you had like these Blackberries, and you had the Nokia communicators, and there were little keyboards attached on the device itself. So you had half a screen and half a keyboard. And Steve Jobs, in the preparation of the launch of that phone, thought about the problem differently. Instead of saying we need a physical device in order to communicate between the human and the device, we need a physical kind of translator, he said, why don't we remove that and have that as a touch screen on the phone? And this technology was already available. It's not like, touch screens weren't available, but nobody had thought of putting it onto the phone itself, for the mass market at least, because they defined the problem differently. And Steve Jobs broke through that traditional thinking and defined the problem differently and found a new solution, a better solution, one that boosted them from almost 0 market share to today 40%. The other reference point I want to give you to alert you how important problem definition is that when you analyze big projects and why they have failed, and there's lots of projects that you can reference in this world that have failed, large construction sites that went over budget or over time or never completed, or any problem that is solved in an organization. When you look at all of these projects and analyze why did they specifically fail, you find that in 70% of the cases, one of the key reasons why they failed was already in the problem definition phase. So not at the very end in the execution, in the implementation, not so much in cracking some of the detailed analyses that needed to be done to solve a sub-problem, but in really setting out from the very beginning what needs to be done. So we want to avoid that happens to our project, right? Because nothing is more painful than realizing in a 6-month project, in months 4, 5, or almost at the end of it, in month 6, that from the very beginning, you set out to solve the wrong thing, or you hadn't included a very important aspect into the problem. There are many references for this. You can check out some of the links that I'm providing here for overviews why projects fail. And you can see from the examples that I've highlighted here, lack of a scope document, poor planning, lack of clearly defined milestones, change in priorities, things that you couldn't anticipate, change in project objectives, and so on. These are all reasons why projects fail, and through better thinking from the very beginning, more inclusive thinking, more free thinking, you can avoid painful mistakes, costly mistakes at the end of the problem-solving process. So why specifically does problem definition fail in these contexts? Why do these projects fail due to problem definition mistakes? I would argue that the biggest issue in this context is that we tend to think with a habitual mind. We tend to think that we are experts. We tend to think that we can already do things, maybe not specifically the problem at hand, but very similar problems. So we look for similarities, we look for existing knowledge, we look for our expertise. And with all of that, we bring in habits that can be very useful and can be very effective in order to help us solve the problem. But at the same time, bringing in these habits also bring in biases and bring in perspectives and exclude other perspectives. There's a famous quote by a Zen teacher, Shunryu Suzuki, who says, "In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the experts there are few." So you can see from that thinking that if you know a lot about an area, and that generally helps you, obviously, in your life and moving about and solving small things in a faster and more effective way, if you tend to be in this habitual thinking all the time as the expert, it's difficult to get into the free thinking mode, where you don't rely on your past, where you don't rely on existing habits, where you don't rely on your biases and the influences of the past. That free thinking mode is difficult to get into. And you can test this very much for yourself, how dominant your habitual thinking mode, the one with which you will automatically enter most problem-solving situations automatically, how strong that thinking mode is. So if you want to consider for just 10 or 20 seconds, what are the thoughts that you've had in the last 24 hours that were truly original? And an original thought is one that, in whole or in essence, has nothing to do with any previous thought. It is a fresh and original thought. A thought that the historic version of yourself has never had or considered. A thought that is not born out of the past, but represents a brand new perspective. How many of such thoughts can you find in the last 24 hours? Consider that for just 10 seconds. So who of you finds none of these thoughts? Who finds one thought? And who can find two? Anybody for three or more? I've done this with hundreds of people, and typically the range that we get is between 0 and 3. And obviously, if you've been to a creative thinking seminar on the day before, then the chances that there are some more new thoughts in your mind during those 24 hours. But if you consider a normal 24 hours in your life, the amount of thinking that you do in a free and novel way is very, very limited. Most of your thinking takes place in habitual thinking. So if your answer right now was 2 or 3, that is not even 1 per mil of the daily thinking that you do, because the average human being has 6,200 thoughts per day. So if it's 2 out of 6,000, that is really a small fraction of your daily thinking. You can do some further tests for this if you want to. One quick game that we can play is called the 9-circle puzzle. So use a piece of paper and draw 9 circles onto it, like you can see on this slide. And your task is to connect those 9 circles with as few lines as possible. Okay? And you are not allowed to lift your pen in between drawing the lines. Okay? Is that clear? So you take a pen and you start connecting the dots with straight lines, no curves or anything, and you finish drawing all those lines that are connected with each other, and only in the end you lift the pen. You don't lift it in between. Try it out. So we found different solutions. The beginning of the conversation was that there is a 5-line solution, right? And the 5-line solution is that you connect the dots, maybe I can show it to you here, like a little snail. And it takes 5 lines to connect all the dots. That is what most of you can come up with within seconds. Most people don't need a full minute once they've understood the task to achieve a 5-line solution to this problem, right? And that's where most people stop and they think, happy, this is a good solution. However, there is a 4-line solution. And the 4-line solution requires you to think a little bit outside of the box. You go from here a little bit further across, then you go down a little bit further, you go up again, and you go back here. So by going outside of the frame of reference, you can achieve a solution that is 20% more productive, 4 lines instead of 5. Some of you say, and the moment is, it's interesting to look at that moment, because the moment basically shows that you brought in, with your habitual mind, a way of thinking that restricts the solution space, but I never introduced these as rules to the game. I never said how large the paper is. I never said how large the circles are. I never restricted you to go with your pen outside of the 9 dots, 9 circles. This is the habitual mind that you bring in that restricts you in effective problem solving. There's actually a 3-line solution. If you start all the way in the upper left of the room and you draw a line through the first 3 circles, you go much, much further, and then you go back and you choose a really small angle in between the lines, then you get 3 lines to connect all the dots. So another 20% more effective, 3 lines instead of 4, instead of 5. You can actually do this with a single line. You take a massive pen that is really huge, big enough to cross all the 9 circles, and you draw it across. Again, I never told you how big the pen is. I never told you how large the distance between the dots has to be. So anything that restricts you from finding the 1-line solution is something that your habitual mind brings into this problem-solving exercise. And that's interesting. And that's interesting but also dangerous at the same time, because if you think about how you solve problems every day, how often you solve them in a purely habitual way, not being aware of potential solutions that sit outside of that frame of reference, which Steve Jobs tried to get out of so strongly. There's another thinking exercise that you can do if you want to. It's also in the book that I'm referencing here on page 67, which I'm not going to go through now, but there's actually 2 more exercises in the book that you can do if you're interested in exploring more how your existing habitual mind traps you in a certain frame of reference only because you bring those assumptions, you bring those biases, you bring those experiences into the game, but the actual situation does not demand for them. And it's not that you're doing anything wrong per se. As human beings, we tend to be in habitual thinking for good reasons a lot of the time. But there's an opportunity to do more of free thinking if we train our minds to detect the clues and the cues which move us into habitual thinking. So habitual thinking, if you want to memorize it as such, is navigating the world with a map. You have experienced something in the past, you know how to do it, you think you're good at it, you think you're the expert, and you bring that mental map of how the world is, how this problem can be solved, and you navigate the problem with the map. And it makes you efficient, makes you fast, makes you reliable, makes you perceived as an expert, all great things. However, you might miss out on a fantastic opportunity to solve a problem with lines 80% more effective, 1 line instead of 5, to invent the new iPhone rather than continuing to having to push buttons on a physical keyboard. We want to move into that free thinking mode. We want to drop those mental maps and be able to see what's going on. Again, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I'm not saying being an expert is a bad thing. Habitual thinking is important. Helps you exclude unfavorable options, reduces the energy that you consume whilst thinking. It enables you to get to decisions faster. For example, with the 5 lines, that was really fast. For most of you, it was 20 seconds or so, whereas the 1-line solution required minutes, hours, days. Habitual thinking, if you do more thinking in the same patterns, obviously supports the development of competencies, makes you predictable and reliable to others, and also helps you create kind of a known understanding of who you are, the expert, the one who can do things, the one who knows things. So for all of these reasons, it's not bad to be in habitual thinking mode, but since it can prevent you from finding the best solution, we want to be aware that there is habitual thinking and there is free thinking, and to be able to get out of habitual thinking mode every once in a while. One of the examples that I love about changing perspectives, and in the end changing from habitual thinking to free thinking, is nothing but enlarging the number of perspectives that you can have on a problem, is this photo of Prince William. And it looks as if he's showing the press and a lot of people in the public in Great Britain, the middle finger. And the same photo was taken from a different angle in the very same moment, and it looks like this. So what he was actually doing, he was showing that there's a third child. His third child was born, and he was very happy about that. He was not angry at anyone. So as just shifting the perspective on this very situation gives you a completely different impression of what is going on, different interpretation in your mind, and enables you to act in very different ways, right? Imagine this happens to you outside of a bar on a Saturday evening. When we are in this habitual thinking mode and we can't see those different perspectives, we bring about into the situation a lot of biases. And you might have heard of biases before, which are essentially mental constructs that you bring into a situation that prevent you from seeing how things are in actual reality. So I've listed a few names on here. You might know some of them. Let's pick two examples. The framing effect. When you see two otherwise identical products, and one of them says 95% fat-free, and the other one says 5% fat, then people tend to buy many, many more of the 95% fat-free rather than the 5% fat, because they are being framed on a positive notion. Although the situation is exactly the same. Both products contain 95 non-fat and 5% fat, but we are framed in a certain direction. So that's an example of a bias where we're doing things, where we're understanding things, and as a result doing things differently, although the situation, the physical situation, the real situation is actually not inviting us to do either of those things. We don't remain a neutral perspective, so to speak. The other famous bias is overconfidence bias, which we tend to have as human beings. The most famous example and one of the earliest examples of this is that when you ask drivers whether they belong to the better half of the driving population, and this experiment was done in the 70s in the United States first, more than 90% of the people say they belong to the better half. So that's statistically impossible, obviously. You cannot have 93% of the population belong to the better half, because the other half needs to exist as well. But that is our overconfidence in our own abilities. And in habitual thinking mode, we tend to bring in many, many of these biases. If you follow the link that I've put on the slide here, you can find 100 different biases that are described in a lot of detail if you're interested in studying this further. As a result of these biases, and going back to the core of problem solving, you make mistakes in the problem solving cycle, especially at the very beginning in the problem definition phase. You can have a flawed problem definition where you are identifying an issue, but actually there's a deeper root cause, a different issue sitting underneath it that you are not aware of. You can go into solution confirmation. We have always done it this way. This works. Why shouldn't it work again? Famous example of this is the expansion of Walmart, the US retailer. They expanded into many countries outside of the US first, and it typically worked quite well. And then they entered Germany, and within a year and a half, they withdrew again because the solution that they had brought, based on how they had defined the problem, which is let's copy-paste the US concept into Germany, that didn't really work in Germany, because the competition was different with Aldi and Lidl. The mindset of the people here was different with respect to discounts. And even the employees' mentality was very different in Germany. And some of the solutions that Walmart brought, for example, singing an anthem for all employees in the morning, was just not working out for employees. But it had worked out in Canada and in Mexico and elsewhere. So they brought this solution. They wanted to confirm it, but it failed. You can work with a very wrong framework, thinking that the framework that you have chosen is appropriate, is complete, is suitable for the situation at hand because of your expertise, because you have used it a million times. But guess what? There is a better one, or yours is flawed, given the very specifics of the current problem you're trying to solve. The problem can be defined too narrowly. As an expert in your habitual thinking mode, you know how these things were solved in the past. You know what worked for you successfully and what didn't. So you bring in a certain framing where the problem begins, how large it expands, and also where it stops, what's excluded, sometimes subconsciously. And that can be too narrow. There can be solutions or aspects of the problem sitting outside of that that you overlook. And finally, it can lead to miscommunication. When you have certain biases, when you come with expertise and habitual thinking that frames you into a certain direction, you will communicate in a certain way, not being very effective in communicating with others who might have a different perspective. So for all of these reasons, you want to make sure that you expand perspective, that you move out of the own perspectives that you have in your habitual mind and move into a free thinking mindset, into a free thinking mode where you can see many, many more perspectives from the very beginning. And that doesn't necessarily mean that all of these perspectives will be carried through the entire 7 steps of the problem-solving cycle, but it means that you are aware of everything that could be relevant. We will later on still learn how to prioritize and deprioritize some of these perspectives and aspects, but in the beginning, it is so important to consider anything that could play a role in this. Dropping an item later typically means not a huge waste of time. If you think about a group problem-solving exercise taking place in this university context or in a company, and let's say that takes a day or two where people sit together and solve, in a project management style, what the problem is and what should be done about it. Doing that for an hour longer or 2 hours longer in a 6-month project or in a 12-month project is really not a waste of time. Asking yourself what else could matter, bringing in new perspectives. Taking that extra hour, extra 2 hours in a project that takes 1 million hours anyway is zero waste, literally. It's a marginal cost. However, not taking those 2 hours, not listening to the other perspectives, not listening to the most introvert person in the room, that could rob you of a perspective that later on becomes very important in your project. And if you figure that out towards the end of the project or in the middle or never, you are wasting a lot of costs and you are wasting a lot of solution potential. So what do we do in order to avoid being stuck in this mindset where we can only see things from our own perspective, from our own expertise? The tool that is offered in the books that I've referenced looks very similar in both books, is something called a problem-solving worksheet. And this is one I've created myself, expanding a little bit on the different boxes that I offer. So there are 9 boxes in total, and you can really start anywhere in this. But let's start with maybe with the top left. Before you decide to do anything about the solution, before you decide to go into any analysis, before you decide to make any aspect of a work plan, before you decide which team members should be involved in problem solving, you want to work on this problem definition sheet, starting with the question, what is the actual trouble that we're experiencing? That's a different phrasing from what's our problem, right? What is the actual trouble? What are the symptoms of the pain of the patient, so to speak? And ask, why is that? Why is that? Why is that? Why is that? Until you arrive at the real trouble that the problem is causing you. Second, going through this clockwise, you want to research a little bit about the company history. If you're doing this as an external consultant, and maybe also if it's your own company, how has this, what's the vision of this company? How does the problem that you are looking at here fit into that? And from an external perspective, what do customers value about this company? Then we're going into the problem background. So what are your company's current biggest challenges and opportunities? What is the CEO's agenda? Anything that sits around the problem that has an impact on it, but it's not actual part of the real problem. We then look at the stakeholders. So who else has an interest, or who has an interest in this problem? Who is a decision maker? Who is an influencer? Who will impact the solution that we are defining, or who will have a say in whether that solution gets implemented or not? Those are important stakeholders that we need to consider in the problem definition phase, because we have to include them in the problem-solving process as early on as possible for them to become aware of what we're doing and for them to have a high chance of supporting our project. If we surprise them at the end of a 6-month project with a solution, it's less likely that they will support it. So we want to make sure that we know who else has a say in this problem and that they can help us get it done. It's very important to look at success criteria. What are the key performance indicators that will shift once we've solved this problem effectively? So write down how you can measure the success of this project, ideally in quantitative terms. Look at risks and challenges. From an outside perspective, looking at this, what are some of the risks in this problem that we have at hand, and how can we potentially mitigate them? The 7th box is about the resources. It's very good to consider what kind of resources you can leverage in the assignment. Who are the people you have access to? What's the data that you have access to? What are some of the experts that you can potentially involve in your network, and so on and so forth. The 8th box respects the scope of the project. When you start solving a problem, or actually as you start thinking about a problem, you might think this relates to a given scope, a geographic scope, an industrial scope, a functional scope. You might come in with a mindset, oh yeah, this is the context in which this takes place. This is where the problem ends, so to speak. This is the frame in which it takes place. Look at that scope and ask a number of people with different perspectives, is that the right scope? Is that the scope as they understand it? And I guarantee you, if you do this with 5 team members and everybody writes down what the exact scope of the project is, people will come up with very different perspectives. And none of them is wrong, none of them is better or worse, but what's important is to put them all onto a single sheet and say, okay, so what do we take away from this as the total scope on which we should be working as a team? And then we're moving into the center of the box. Then we start defining the problem statement itself. So likely at the beginning of the process, you already have an idea of what the problem definition is. So if you think about the problem that you brought into this room with you to work on over the next couple of weeks or months, you already have an idea how you would phrase that. If I asked you to write it down, you could write it down. But after going through these 8 boxes, some of that might shift. And you might get a better, a different, a more inclusive definition of your problem. So that's what you want to do in the end. You want to write down at the center of the sheet in a single sentence, what is the problem statement that you are going to deal with over the course of this project. It's very essential that you do that. And again, if you're working in a team, I recommend that you do this first separately, that everybody writes down their problem definition first, and that only after you have all considered your own thoughts, you look at each other's problem definitions, and then you think, okay, what are the different perspectives here, and how can we create a best of all version from this that respects all of the 8 boxes that we've looked at, and that includes as many perspectives as possible, so that the chance of us discovering something in one of the next 6 steps of the problem-solving process that we hadn't thought of in the very beginning is minimized. Okay, that was my input on how to define a problem in a very effective way. Maybe we can look at some of the key, or we can look at an example of a problem that I had to solve in the past. When I was working for a large retailer in the past, one of the problems that we faced was with old stock issues before a peak, before a Christmas season. So this was an e-commerce retailer, and every year before Christmas, obviously these retailers get a lot of orders in. And what you want to ensure if you are experiencing such a peak in your business is that your operations are perfectly prepared for it. And one of the issues that I was responsible for was to get rid of old stock, or to manage the old stock. And old stock is defined as stock, as items that you carry in your warehouses that have been lying there for a long time, that customers don't seem to be buying in the amounts that you predicted. And therefore, they've been there for months or years, and you want to get rid of them because the longer you keep that stock, the less valuable it becomes. So the problem that I got from my boss's boss was, hey, Andreas, how can we solve our old stock issue to prepare for Christmas season, for the peak of 2016? And having been trained in problem solving, I used a problem solving sheet to solve this assignment. And I went through some of the things that matter to this. So from a company history perspective, that company wanted to be Earth's most customer-centric company. So we wanted to be in stock at all times. That's important to know. Why do we have so much old stock? Well, because we wanted to be available for customers, right? The trouble of this, asking, why does my boss's boss try to solve this? Well, there is a lack of space for new, more profitable items that everybody wants to buy around Christmas. The PlayStation 4 or a drone or something else. If you don't have space in your warehouses to put these things so that they can be shipped to customers fast, then people won't be ordering them. So you want to make sure that the space is available for those profitable and quickly turning over products. Who are the stakeholders? Well, my boss's boss, the CEO of the company. The category management, because there's people in the organization who manage the different categories, who are responsible for the profit and loss of those categories as well. So when you try to get rid of an old stock, they have a say in that too, because we're affecting their profit and loss account. And resellers were involved in this, because if my company couldn't sell these old stocks, maybe there are some other sellers in the market who have different set of customers, who sell in bulk or have other solutions, and they might simply be better people at selling these products, so we could sell them to those resellers and they would sell them to end customers. Those are kind of the stakeholders that were involved. My boss roughly gave me the indication that old stock should not should be reduced from the current volumes down 90% to about 10%, because that was the number that we could work with if we wanted to have a successful Christmas season. What are the risks and challenges? Well, if you're trying to get rid of stock that you once thought would sell well, that becomes old stock, nobody is buying, you typically are facing high write-offs because you need to lower your prices or sell them to resellers at a massive discount for them to be able to make their own profit with these items. And the second risk in this project was that I would fail to reduce old stock by 90%. What resources did I have? Well, I had under me also the pricing team, so I could literally drop prices for items in the way that I wanted to. That was my biggest leverage. If you drop the price of an item, typically there's more demand, and eventually that old stock will be sold. And we could do advertising. We could advertise on our website and also through other channels that we are, doing a clearance sale or something like this. And items would drop, and people should come to the website and check out what great offers we have. The scope of the project, in my understanding, was all of the European operations of this e-commerce retailer. So there you go. That was my definition of the problem, and I thought I was set up for a good start, and we started working on this, and stocks kept reducing. Obviously, we had some write-offs, and we made some losses, but that was expected, and that was part of the framing that the CEO had already told me about. But as we were working on this project, several months into the project, there was something else that we found, which is we have this problem every year, not just in 2016. And actually, my boss's boss was not specific when they said, solve this for peak 2016. I checked the old emails. They never specified that. That came out of my habitual assumption. My boss has a problem with this Christmas, so let's fix it. What he actually wanted is to have this looked at as a reoccurring problem. He didn't want an Andreas who can, sell items at a large discount quickly. He also wanted that, but what he wanted more is like to not experience this trouble every year again. So what we needed in terms of success factors, what needed to be added as a perspective into this worksheet was that we need a system solution rather than a one-off solution. As a result of that, we changed the problem definition in the center of this. We don't want to solve this for peak 2016, but for all the future peaks. We don't want to be in a situation where every peak we're facing this problem of having massive write-offs in order to clear our inventory. So as a result, that means we had to include software engineering as stakeholders in the project. They cared about the right solution, and actually they were the ones who had to code the right solution for this. Because a lot of the algorithms that determine whether people buy something or not are obviously coded by those software engineers in e-commerce retailers. And then, as we approached the Christmas season, we got more and more involved with the operations people, who were actually working on the floor, clearing out these inventories. And while we didn't have them on the list of stakeholders in the very beginning, because they were simply the ones executing and carrying out the orders that the customers bring in, we found that through the conversations with them, that what we should actually optimize for is not the value of the products, but the cubic meters that these products occupy. In our systems, we had always solved by value because that was the view that we could take in the systems. We saw there are items that are worth 1,000 euros and there are items worth 10 euros. And in terms of priorities, we got rid of the stuff that was highly valuable first, because we wanted to make sure that these get sold at the lowest potential write-offs. Talking to operations, we often found that the highly valuable items are really tiny. It might sound obvious to you, but there's really a lot of examples for this, right? Especially in electronics. You can have a camera or a laptop. It occupies virtually no space in a warehouse, but it's extremely valuable. And us focusing on value, we didn't necessarily focus on what's large. But the problem objective was to solve for space and not for value. But our systems view didn't generate that. So we had to add a view which estimated the cubic meters related to the storage capacity that a product needs in order to change our priorities, how we program the algorithm so that it prioritizes getting rid of large items in a case of old stock rather than the small items where we really have more runway to get rid of it. You can probably put 100 laptops into the space of a single bed mattress, and that mattress will be worth 200 euros, and 100 laptops are probably worth like 200,000 euros or more. So this was the next thing that changed in this process, but it was a painful experience for me. And remember, I had already been a consultant for 5 years, so it's really a showcase of people making mistakes or thinking habitually about problems all the time and not considering relevant perspectives, no matter how experienced or inexperienced they are. Problem solving, strategic problem solving is a process, and processes can be improved, and that's why you're sitting here, and that's great. And even when you are a master of problem solving, you will still figure out new things, and you will still make small mistakes, and you will still be able to catch yourself in habitual thinking, thinking, oh, 3 months ago I didn't have this perspective that I have now. I wish I had done so. So before I'm going to ask you to fill in this problem-solving sheet yourself, to define more accurately the problems that you have brought into this room in order to work on it, I want to quickly go through some key takeaways here. So the first thing that's hopefully become clear is that you want to invest time to define the problem. We are, as human beings, we are monsters of a bias for action. We want to get into doing things fast, right? Because we feel like real progress is made only when we're working on something, when we're moving physically, when we're working on solutions. But remember Steve Jobs, and remember that anecdote, and remember that if you don't define the problem well, you might experience many problems later on, making you much less effective. And if you do define the problem well, you might already find the solution in the first place. So invest that time well. Second, force other perspectives into the problem definition by working in a team and trying to ensure that there is diversity in your team. The diversity of the solution, all else being equal, by a team made up of 5 business students is less than when you have a business student, an engineering student, and 3 other students from different backgrounds, or people from different countries, different experience levels, seniority, and so on. So diversity in your team automatically brings in new perspectives, and that's very valuable for the beginning of the problem-solving cycle. Third, be empathetic to users of the solution and decision makers. So the operations example in the operations people in the example that I have shared just now, and in general, the people who have to work with the solution that you are providing, be empathetic to them. From the very beginning, try to anticipate what it is that they want to get out of it, what are the problems that they are experiencing currently, and what the potential solution might mean for them. Fourth, and I haven't mentioned this specifically, but I think it's an important takeaway when you consider everything that we've talked about for the last half an hour or so, you should target the highest problem. Don't settle for small problems. As you experience that what you are working on has a, let's call it a mother problem that sits above it, that actually, needs to be resolved in order for the child problem to be resolved, then always push for having that solution solved. And if your discussions with all the stakeholders and all involved people on your team and externally lead to the conclusion that, that is too big a problem to solve, you can always, go one step smaller. But from the very beginning, try to set out to solve the big picture. 5, iterate and refine your problem statement as you learn more about it. So soon we will go into the next 6 steps of the problem-solving cycle. And you might have the impression that this is a bit of a linear process. First you define the problem, and then you do step 2, step 3, and so on. However, no matter how freely you think, and no matter how easy it is for you to leverage both your expertise and let go of your expertise, and how many people you involve, no matter how well you do that, there will always be things that you learn about at a later stage. And when you realize those things, when you learn about those things, it's important that you go back to your problem definition sheet and say, now that we know this, does this, what we set out to start with, does it actually change? And if it does, make the changes and consider the steps that you have already worked on and whether those steps would have changed, whether there needs to be whether there are things that need to be added or removed. Finally, always mind your habitual mind. We've done a few exercises about this. You can trust me when I say more than 99.9% of the time that you are thinking in a habitual way, in a way that you have done in the past, in a way that you consider yourself to be an expert in something, to know something, to have something already figured out. And very often you are right. And when it comes to small problems in your life, choosing the toothbrush, choosing your pair of shoes, choosing what to wear, you can rely on your expertise and your existing know-how. But when it comes to the big things in life, the projects that take 6 months, the projects where you commit for a lifetime, those projects are the ones where you want to be especially aware and mindful of your habitual mind and consider investing into the addition and the exploration of many, many more perspectives so that you can set out perfectly at the beginning of this project and not discover issues later on that you could have discovered already at the beginning. Okay, so I'm providing you with worksheets that look like this, with the 9 boxes, and I would like you to all work on the problem that you brought into this room and see how this problem definition that you brought this morning might change as you go through these individual boxes. And I'm here to help you do that.